Muy buenos días a todos, bienvenidos a este primer panel del seminario Combate a la Corrupción, Balance para una Propuesta, en el cual vamos a tratar de comenzar por lo más básico. Y es un panel en el que discutiremos de qué se habla cuando se habla de corrupción. Tenemos una espléndida lista de invitados que seguramente aportarán muchas cosas a este debate, en el cual, como todos los que estudian corrupción, rendición de cuentas o políticas públicas en general, saben, lo más importante cuando se trata de imaginar propuestas para definir soluciones a problemas serios es empezar por lo básico, que es entender el problema. En América Latina, ustedes lo saben muy bien, llevamos varias décadas teniendo el tema de la corrupción como uno de los más serios problemas en la agenda pública. Cualquier encuesta, revisión que se hace sobre las expectativas de los ciudadanos nos muestran un enorme desencanto con el régimen democrático, no tanto en términos de régimen, sino como su funcionamiento para lograr acotar la discrecionalidad de sus gobernantes y aumentar la eficacia de los gobiernos, y se apunta generalmente a la corrupción como uno de esos problemas. Y lo mismo pasa, hablando en el caso concreto de México, desde las pretendidas soluciones. Llevamos más de 30 años construyendo instituciones, creando leyes, definiendo procedimientos, y cada vez se ofrece una nueva construcción del problema público de la corrupción. Hace 30 años nos decían que la corrupción era un asunto de una falla moral y que por lo tanto lo que se necesitaba era que nos renováramos moralmente para acabar con la corrupción. Después se nos decía que la corrupción era un problema de un Estado que hacía demasiadas cosas y entonces necesitábamos que el Estado hiciera menos para que fuéramos menos corruptos. Pasamos por explicaciones asociadas al proceso de democratización o a puntualizaciones muy concretas de procedimientos, trámites. Después lo vinculamos con transparencia y cada vez vamos redefiniendo un problema de corrupción, construyendo nuevos intentos de soluciones, pero encontrándonos cada año cuando Huguet Labelle presenta el Índice de Transparencia Internacional, datos espantosos sobre cómo México no avanza consistentemente en materia de combate a la corrupción. Por eso tenemos este panel en el cual empezaremos, insisto, por lo básico, por tratar de entender de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de corrupción. Le voy a ceder en primer lugar la palabra al profesor Bo Rothstein. Él es doctor en Ciencia Política por la Universidad Sueca de Lund y ha sido profesor en la Universidad de Uppsala y actualmente dirige el Centro de Calidad de Gobierno en la Universidad de Gotemburgo, en Suecia. Ha sido miembro honorario en varias universidades, en la Russell Sage Foundation, en la Universidad de Harvard, y tiene publicaciones muy importantes que son referencia obligada para, no solo para politólogos, administradores públicos, sino en concreto esta intersección de capacidades gubernamentales, o como él lo llama, calidad de gobierno y combate a la corrupción, que seguramente nos darán muchas guías sobre cómo entender el problema de corrupción. Profesor Rothstein, bienvenido a México, bienvenido a este seminario. Adelante, por favor.
Thank you. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here and talk about this very important subject. Can I please have my PowerPoint presentation, please? While they are trying to fix technologies, let me start by saying that what we are facing is an interesting situation. Corruption was basically a non-issue until the mid-1990s. I would say that I and my generation of political scientists in my part of the world, and I think that is also true in other parts of the world, went through their basic education and PhD education without this subject ever being on the agenda. Now we have a very different situation. Anti-corruption and corruption, good governance, quality of government has become very high on the political agenda. And that is, of course, very reassuring. The situation is that more and more empirical work show that this is a very serious problem for human well-being. And how serious this is can be seen by, if you compare with measures of democratization, countries that have had low corruption perform much, much better when it comes to standard measures of human well-being, standard measures of political legitimacy, standard measures of economic prosperity, and to my surprise also standard measures of human happiness. This is not an argument from me against democracy, it's just saying that democracy is not enough if you do not can have a system that reasonably well controls corruption. So let me start by saying something about where I come from. This is the Quality of Government Institute at University of Gothenburg. I would like to underline, since we are dealing with a sensitive topic, that this is an independent, pure academic research institute, basically in political science. We started in 2004 with a minor grant to create a database. We have major funding from Swedish sources and then from European Union sources. It's now an operation for about 30 researchers, so it's quite large for the social sciences. And what may be of interest to many of you is that I think we now have the world's largest data banks on any measures of corruption, any measures of what corruption can be caused by, and any measures you can think about that is the effect of having low and high corruption. We also have 3 very huge surveys, and I would like to underline that all our data is in the public domain. The minute we have access to our data, everyone else have access to the data. There are on our website, about 200 publications, books, articles, working papers, and so on. Now, we are dealing here with what in the social sciences is known as a highly contested concept. And what I would like to talk about is research that we have been doing, trying to figure out if people in different parts of the world have similar or different understanding of corruption. Is corruption culture specific, or is it basically a universal understanding of corruption? Is the, as some critics have argued, is the international anti-corruption regime to be seen as a new form of liberal Western ideological hegemony? Or is it to be applying Western anti-corruption standard to developing countries? Is this just a sign of post-colonialism? There are a large number of social scientists arguing this. Now, the problem with existing definitions, such as the standard definition, abuse of public power for private gain, is that this is an empty definition, since what should count as abuse is not defined. And this leads to an enormous problem, because then, of course, corruption in Nigeria is something completely different than corruption in Mexico, which is completely different than corruption in Denmark. And for empirical social scientists like us, this invites not relatives, but relativism, and it makes it impossible actually to measure the level of corruption in different countries, regions. And if we cannot find measures that are reasonably reliable, we will not be able to explain the variation of corruption. If we cannot explain the variation of corruption, we will not be able to find policies that are effective against corruption. So this definitional problem is not a thing of academic civilities. It has very important implications for what we actually will be able to do against corruption. Now, let me show some data from the Afrobarometer. This is
Los dos chicos.
the question if Africa is different. It's a little difficult to see, but the questions that have been raised are the three following. A public official decides to locate a development project in an area where his friends and supporters lived. A government official demands a favor or an additional payment for some service that should be part of his
O sea, el
job.
periodismo lo dejaste
Or
rapidísimo.
they give jobs to people that do not have the right qualifications, but that are relatives or party affiliated.
Nota dura y pura.
And then the people can answer if they think this is not wrong at all, wrong but understandable, wrong and should be punished. And as you can see, a large majority of respondents in African countries say this is wrong and should be punished. This is also what we find from our ethnographic work that we have been doing. We have sent assistants to interview people in Africa about their perceptions of corruption, and this is what we find. Now, if you take this critique from post-colonialism seriously, it's interesting to go back to what is known as the Bible in post-colonial research. This is the book published in 1961 by a very famous author, Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. Actually, it has a foreword by the very famous Jean-Paul Sartre.
Por eso, pero entonces
But
tendrías
this
que
is
haber
what
verificado que se pudiera grabar aquí.
Fanon writes about corruption. He actually mentions it as a very
O si no, que se
serious
traiga
problem
Luis de otra
in
cámara,
the West
y con otra
African
cámara lo
countries that
hacemos.
he was studying. Scandals are numerous. Ministers grow rich. Their wives dole themselves out. The members of parliament feather their nests, and there is not a soul down to the simple policeman or the custom officers who does not join in the great procession of corruption. So this was already in the 1960s by sort of the grandfather of post-colonial research, seen as a serious problem.
Vas a cumplir 5 años. Este tiene un año.
Now, we have carried out a number of surveys. One is what we call the European Quality of Government surveys. It's 2 citizen surveys for European Union countries.
Pero me volví a casar y ahorita tengo dos
Please.
chavitos, uno de 5 y uno de
Can I get my presentation back?
Yeah, that's
Thank
good.
you. The first round was in 2008 and had 34,000 respondents in 18 countries. And the next round it was just now in 2012 with 84,000 respondents in 25 countries. So the total number of interviews is over 100. This is by far the largest survey that have been done in
Ella y
this
su
area.
hermana fueron a mi boda, cabrón.
And the sample is a little nice because it's based on regions within the European Union countries. So we can compare different regions
Y
in
de
the
familia,
countries.
pues está pensando que no antes de los 30.
And it does pretty detailed questions about personal experience and perceptions of corruption. But not only corruption,
Y
we
Natalia, mi
also
mujer, es la directora de
included
publicaciones del CIDE.
questions about general fairness of the public
Y su
administration,
padre también fue antes,
such as the
un par de años antes,
question if the norm of impartiality in the exercise of public power is breached. So the questions run like this. The police force gives special advantages to certain people in my area.
¿Qué pues, se pudo o
Or,
no se pudo, caballeros?
hello.
Para grabar.
All citizens are treated equally by the police force in my area. And then we have the same for public education and healthcare. And the results are quite interesting. First, I should say, any idea that corruption is not a problem in Europe, just forget it. Countries like Italy and Greece now score much lower than a handful of African countries. And there are huge variation, not only within Europe, but also within European countries. But the interesting thing is that in countries where a large majority perceive that their authorities are corrupt, there is actually only a small fraction who say that they have paid bribes. Bribes is not the big thing here. What is the big thing is various forms of favoritism. So this is in the implementation of public services that people find corruption. It's not so much bribes, but things like you will never get a public contract if you don't belong to the right party. You will never get employment in the local public administration if you don't have friends or families there. Your children will not be accepted to universities if you do not have contacts there. So it's much more favoritism, various forms of favoritism that people perceive as corruption, where bribes is actually the small thing. And I think this is quite positive because my friends, the philosophers, say that the opposite to justice is really not equality, because many inequalities can be defended. Talented people, for example, should have more. The opposite to justice, they say, is favoritism. Now, this is published last month in this book, me and my two colleagues, Nicolas Charon and Victor Laparente, Quality of Government and Corruption from a European Perspective, and all the data, I should also say, is publicly available. Now, in order to further go down this line, I've started work with anthropologists. So this is where anthropology meets political scientists. So it's a paper, soon an article by me and a very able anthropologist, David Torcello at Bergamo. The title of the paper is Corruption Among Indigenous Culture, Understanding the Universalist Particularism Puzzle. And here we have, and it's my colleague who have found this data source. It's just fantastic. It's the human relation area files assembled at Yale. It's detailed cases or studies of 258 indigenous cultures. And it's all 600,000 pages. And of course, you understand you can search this with modern technology. And all of these have been collected by professional anthropologists. And what we find here is corruption is understood as a general phenomena among different types of indigenous people. And my explanation for this, I use a theory that I call the public goods approach. And the public goods approach runs something like this. Every society, no matter how indigenous or tribal, have to come up with some public goods. Security, maybe some infrastructure, common purposes for hunting or getting food. And what people in also very indigenous cultures perceive as corruption is when those who are set to manage these public goods transform them into private goods. So this is the explanation for why people in indigenous societies do not really have a very different understanding of corruption than Danes. So the conclusion is that ordinary people in different cultures, they understand corruption basically as we do. And this is quite important because then corruption is actually not a problem of bad ethics. We don't have to go to Nigeria and say your ethics, they are bad. Instead, it should be understood as a problem of collective action. People participate in corruption because, one, they think that everyone else is doing this, and two, they perceive that they are in a situation where they have no other choice. If their kids are going to be immunized, if the police are going to protect them, if they are going to make a living, they have to participate, but they do not thereby think it's morally correct. As my colleague Karklins has elegantly formulated it, what they say is, the system makes us do it. This has, of course, enormous implications for how you should think about policies against corruption, because then you do not only have to make people change, you have to make people think that most other people in their situation are now also willing to change. And in another article I have called it, this calls for a kind of Big Bang approach to corruption. You cannot attack it incrementally. And what's good for, I think, our research is that based on these three types of data, I think we can say that we now know what type of norm that is abused when corruption occurs. And that norm is the impartiality in the exercise of public power. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Rothstein, por esta primera intervención que empieza a sentar las líneas de discusión, no solo sobre la conceptualización de corrupción, sino, como cerró muy bien, sobre las opciones reales y el tipo de intervenciones que se requerirían para empezar a modificar esta situación de acción colectiva, este problema de acción colectiva, como lo frasea él, en el cual el problema, como lo ha escrito en otros lugares, no es un asunto de agente principal, sino un asunto de acción colectiva, donde no alcanzan las sanciones, sino se requiere una intervención extensiva y deliberada para modificar comportamientos. Ahora tenemos en segundo lugar al profesor Daniel Schneider. Él es director del Centro de Corrupción en la Escuela de Servicio Internacional de la American University. Él estudió Derecho en la Universidad de Pensilvania y tiene estudios de maestría en Historia por la London School of Economics y de Gobierno por la Kennedy School of Government de la Universidad de Harvard. Ha ejercido en el Departamento de Criminología del Departamento de Justicia en Estados Unidos y ha sido asesor legal para Rusia en la misma institución. Él se desempeñó como consultor del Banco Mundial, de la American Bar Association y de otras ONGs en asuntos relacionados precisamente con corrupción, aplicación de la ley, gobernabilidad y sociedad civil. Actualmente él es director del Center of Non-Traditional Threats and Corruption de la American University en Washington. Okay. Bueno, guardaremos al profesor Schneider para el siguiente turno en lo que terminan de preparar su presentación PowerPoint, y entonces le cedería la palabra a Munadora Bukahin, que es licenciada en Derecho, licenciada en Educación, tiene una maestría en Administración por el TEC de Monterrey y es doctoranda en Derecho por la Universidad Nacional. Es fundadora y vicepresidenta de la Asociación de Examinadores de Fraude Certificados y actualmente es la directora general de Auditoría Forense en la Auditoría Superior de la Federación de México. Por favor, adelante.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, buenos días a todos. Primeramente agradezco la invitación hecha a este evento. Mauricio Merino, muchas gracias a todos por la atención que han tenido y el éxito de este seminario. Quisiera yo comenzar haciendo un agregado a la pregunta rectora de este panel. ¿De qué y cómo se habla cuando hablamos de corrupción? Tendríamos que hacer reflexiones serias. Cuando hablamos de corrupción lo hacemos indignados por los daños económicos, lo hacemos enojados por el daño social que ocasiona, lo hacemos escandalizados o con envidia profunda sobre los bienes y beneficios que otros se apropian, o tenemos entonces una reflexión seria que nos permite tener la percepción exacta de la gravedad del problema. Y cuando hablamos de percepción me refiero a que cada quien tiene una carga emocional y una historia que nos puede hacer modificar esa percepción en ocasión de nuestras necesidades primarias. ¿Qué es lo que moldean nuestra percepción? Lo que vemos, lo que oímos, lo que escuchamos en medios. ¿Lo hacemos con objetividad o con mesura? ¿Cómo hablamos nosotros de la corrupción? ¿Lo hacemos trivializándolo, chacoteando, como decimos en nuestro país? ¿Lo tomamos a la ligera? ¿O cuando hablamos de corrupción quisiéramos que se volviera un tema que de verdad todos nos apropiáramos de él y que empezáramos a hacer una reflexión y nos preguntáramos por qué nos indignamos, por qué es un problema sistémico y complejo que por más foros y acciones que se implementen no se logra inhibir? Hablamos en tono displicente y no vamos a poder entender el fenómeno y las conductas ocasionadas hasta que no tengamos lo que llamamos empatía, ponernos en los zapatos del otro. Cuando empecemos a entender por qué la sociedad percibe el fenómeno de corrupción en relación a sus propios intereses, vamos a saber que el problema radica realmente en que no tenemos un resultado tangible y no nos sentimos como una sociedad protegidos y con las necesidades mínimas satisfechas. En este entorno, diríamos, sabemos todos la diferencia entre el bien y el mal, son cuestiones inherentes a los humanos. Optar por la corrupción es un modo de vida, pero también optar por la honestidad sería un modo de vida. La cuestión es por qué optamos en muchas ocasiones, aquellos que somos honestos, por hacer actos inapropiados que nos hacen sentir mal. Seguramente es porque los medios, las normas y el sistema en el que vivimos, tomo un poco y coincido con lo que mi antecesor, el doctor Bo, ha comentado, nos obligan a hacerlo. Optar por la honestidad en muchas ocasiones, incluso en nuestro país, puede resultar en un severo daño, no únicamente a nuestra vida, sino a nuestros bienes, patrimonio, en nuestra familia. Entonces, ¿por qué México es altamente vulnerable al fraude y la corrupción? Y entonces me digo, estamos en una catástrofe escandalosa. La corrupción realmente es una catástrofe. Podríamos calificarla de infausta. Lo vemos quizás de otro modo porque vivimos de una manera más individual. Nos preocupamos, y eso a razón de nuestra cultura, es una percepción que yo tengo, generamos satisfacer las necesidades de mis afectos. Con el rol cultural que nos ha apropiado, que nos ha dado la sociedad, pensamos que la autoridad de la familia, la que provee, es la que es responsable ante ella, ante sus afectos, de poder tenerlos bien, de que tengan todas sus necesidades inmediatas, y no queremos escuchar reclamos de ellos acerca de nuestra actitud. Y entonces, cuando vemos que la corrupción nos da beneficios inmediatos, y del otro lado vemos que la deshonestidad nos puede acarrear miles de problemas y un largo y sinuoso camino que nadie está dispuesto a caminar con nosotros ni a protegernos, no nos queda otra opción. Esa es una de las razones principales que yo he aprendido a lo largo de mi vida profesional a entender. Quiero compartirles que anteriormente yo era rígida en este sentido. Descalificaba a las personas deshonestas de antemano. Pensaba yo que eran mediocres, pusilánimes, que por qué actuaban así pudiendo actuar de otra manera. Hasta que empecé a tener un acercamiento mayor ya hace algunos años en las áreas de pobreza de este país, que es donde más azota la necesidad, y entendíamos que por más que les expliquemos que por qué permiten que los líderes en algunos casos les quiten el recurso a los que están destinados, porque ellos permiten o firman documentos sabedores que el recurso no está llegando a sus manos, y la respuesta es: nadie va a venir a luchar por nosotros. El estar en contra de la comunidad nos va a traer problemas personales, y me tocó vivir en alguna parte del sureste del país que inclusive eran expulsados por estar contrarios a lo que las costumbres disponían. ¿Cómo podemos todos, a partir de estos foros y desde nuestra trinchera, ayudarlos? Realmente esto resulta imposible. Esa actividad preponderante que correspondería al gobierno, a todos los que están involucrados en esas actividades, realmente no se percibe, es sumamente ineficaz. Y esto debe ser porque si la corrupción es sistémica y entendemos que las leyes están establecidas para crear en un entorno que cada uno de los que estamos involucrados, instituciones y organizaciones, despleguemos acciones para prevenir e inhibir estos actos, no lo hacemos. Con que una no funcione, todo lo demás deja de funcionar. También estamos apostando nosotros a que todas las personas que elegimos y que están en el poder público son personas inteligentes, serias y capaces de pensar en el bienestar común, en poner por delante los derechos fundamentales, los derechos humanos y el bienestar colectivo, situación que también en la vida cotidiana sabemos que no pasa. ¿Cuántos de los que estamos aquí hemos tenido incentivos que nos permitan optar por la honestidad en lugar de prestarnos a un acto deshonesto o corrupto? ¿Por qué abusan del poder aquellos que tienen en sus manos la decisión de un trámite que nos interesa muchísimo y pone en riesgo muchas veces nuestra salud, nuestro futuro, nuestra propia vida familiar al sentirnos defraudados? La frustración entre todos al sentirnos impotentes de poder hacer algo o acceder a una protección, y no hablo de una manera paternalista, hablo de algo que sería inherente a cada actividad que realicemos. Y pongo un ejemplo de hace 2 días que seguramente todos hemos visto. Gente muy cercana de todos mis afectos que fue asaltada en una pseudopatrulla regresando de Querétaro en la noche por 6 personas. Aparte del despojo que les hicieron de todos sus bienes, el susto, les quitaron iban de vacaciones fuera, obviamente ya no pudieron ir con 2, 3 años de ahorro para ello. ¿Qué pasa cuando van a hacer la denuncia? Primeramente llegan al aeropuerto donde encuentran policías, asustados, aterrorizados, todavía en shock, y les dicen: nos acaban de asaltar, no tenemos ni siquiera para hacer una llamada, ¿nos pueden ayudar? La indolencia de esos uniformados nos duele a todos. Ni siquiera para atender una emergencia que esperaríamos que cualquier humano se pusiera en nuestros zapatos y pudiese ofrecernos el apoyo de una llamada telefónica. ¿Qué menos esperar otro apoyo o el qué hacer? Ya no vamos a hablar de las instituciones bancarias, financieras, que en su momento, cuando se les reporta el hecho para evitar algún un posterior acto ilícito, no tienen sistema, no podemos atenderlo, llame en 10 minutos. La indolencia forma parte de la corrupción. Este es un ejemplo mínimo que lo podemos repercutir a ejercicios de salud. Gente que estando en el quirófano en instituciones públicas, en el quirófano le informan que el doctor no pudo llegar porque tuvo algún problema, que el aparato está descompuesto, que el dinero para la casa, el crédito no es posible. Tantas y tantas experiencias que pudiésemos y todos conocemos, compartir con ustedes, que entonces decimos: ¿cómo podemos convencernos todos de tener actitudes honestas y esperar que los de arriba, que los colegas, nuestros iguales, actúen de una manera ética? También tendríamos que reflexionar que los de arriba también son víctimas de la corrupción. No crean que se salvan. En este contexto, la diferencia entre la protección a la familia, que consideramos nuestro deber, el beneficio que pensamos que nos dan esos actos, nos hace pensar que la causa de la impunidad es la corrupción. La corrupción es un acto deshonesto, pero tiene que ver en sí con la impunidad. ¿Cómo podríamos nosotros entender que si no aceptamos beneficios vamos a tener el incentivo que estamos esperando? ¿Cómo podemos saber que no vamos a complicar nuestra vida? ¿Cómo sabemos que en una denuncia podemos nosotros sentirnos protegidos y sabemos que estamos haciendo lo correcto? Si a la larga lo que estuviésemos esperando nunca va a llegar, y al contrario, vamos a tener agresiones inclusive pasivas, porque la corrupción no únicamente genera problemas económicos o grandes desvíos, no amanecemos únicamente pensando cuál es el fraude del día. Habemos muchas de las personas que sufrimos actos corruptos como acoso sexual, acoso laboral, se nos exigen conductas inapropiadas a cambio de los favores que hacemos, y eso afecta nuestra autoestima y nuestro amor propio. Y aunque no lo podamos externar, tenemos que sentirnos dolidos, frustrados, y eso lo repercutimos en nuestra familia y en nuestros hijos. Nos sentimos de menos. Estas cuestiones a lo mejor son muchas que no se ven en un programa macro, pero tendríamos que entender cuál es el modelo idóneo, qué tendríamos que hacer todos para que tengamos realmente una política de integridad. Integridad es algo que no se ha tocado, integridad es lo que tendríamos que tener todos los que en este país tenemos una responsabilidad, tanto en organizaciones públicas como en organizaciones privadas. Muchos riesgos y pocos beneficios es lo que encontramos cuando queremos actuar de manera honesta. Entonces tendríamos también que entender que sí hay gente en cuya esencia la corrupción pandea, pero también habemos personas que nos han obligado a optar por la deshonestidad. Y sabemos que esas personas somos las más, que no podemos aceptar que digan que México es un país corrupto, porque la generalidad no es así. Pero también sabemos que tenemos que tener una articulación seria y coordinada entre todas las instituciones que nos permitan inhibir estos actos. Que la recompensa por denunciar no sea que nos quedemos sin trabajo, que nos persigan en la familia, que tengamos al delincuente afuera de nuestra casa. Tenemos que salir de ese círculo. Creo que hablar de corrupción sistémica o fraude organizado es casi lo mismo. Finalmente, todos callamos, todos silenciamos. Yo no quiero broncas, nos decimos, la vida de por sí es dura. Lo que menos quiero es afrontar cuestiones y entonces camino por la vida sin ver lo que sucede a mi alrededor. Elegir ser corrupto es un modelo cultural. Creo yo que no tenemos razón alguna que nos incentive a cambiar este modelo y que podamos pensar que podemos cambiar las cosas a partir de una serie de denuncias. Tendríamos que pensar qué se puede hacer realmente en nuestro país para que podamos salir adelante. Regreso a la pregunta, ¿de qué y cómo se habla cuando hablamos de corrupción? Hablamos de apropiarnos del problema entre todos, de dejar la indolencia a un lado. Hablo de valores preponderantes, de los derechos humanos, de los derechos sociales, de dejar de pensar que entonces si yo logro mi objetivo, ¿qué me importa el que logre el de al lado? Sino que tenemos que tener un bien común para que entonces podamos ser un pueblo realmente feliz, pero feliz que se sienta desde adentro de las familias y se externe, que salgamos felices, tranquilos, y aunque lo vemos un poco lejos, creo que puede ser algo de lo que podamos realizar. Entonces podemos decir, tendremos que decir cada uno de nosotros, hablar con seriedad, dejar de trivializar la corrupción, educar, la fomentación de valores, la ética. Finalmente los valores se transmiten, pero los valores por sí mismos, la educación, la ética, no van a poder hacer gran cosa si no articulamos hacia la realidad. Sentirnos protegidos, sentir que cada quien realiza la parte que le corresponde y erradicar de alguna manera, parcialmente, e inhibir la corrupción. Dejemos de hablar de corrupción como un poder corrosivo sin atender medidas preventivas. Dejemos de hablar de que la corrupción está altamente publicitada, pero sin hacer nada. Creo que hablemos lo que hablemos, el equilibrio está en todo. Entonces, finalmente, porque la corrupción es un serio problema, creo que debemos hablar muy en serio de la corrupción. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias por su intervención. Efectivamente, es fundamental hablar muy en serio de la corrupción. Tenemos a continuación al profesor, ahora sí, Daniel Schneider, de quien ya hice la presentación. Solo reitero, actualmente es director del Centro de Corrupción de la Escuela de Servicio Internacional de la American University en Estados Unidos. Profesor, bienvenido.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be in Mexico City, a city to which I've traveled frequently in the past couple of years doing some research. So what do we talk about when we talk about corruption? Obviously, the title of this panel. Obviously, you've seen we've all heard some of the common definitions of corruption. The most common is the abuse of public power for personal gain. The U.S. Agency for International Development has recently expanded that a bit, calling it the abuse of entrusted authority for private gain. There are many definitions. I'm not going to try and add another one. But perhaps when it comes to political corruption, the best way to think about it is the remark of an old woman in Chicago. Chicago is known for many things, including its colorful and often corrupt politicians. This woman said, "After I die, I want to be buried in Chicago so I can remain active in local politics." Okay. I want to talk about two things today. The first is transparency to accountability, which I've subtitled The Road Not Easily Traveled. So what are some, it's interesting in English as well as in Spanish, and I don't know about French and Swedish, but there is no antonym to corruption. You cannot capture the opposite in one word. There are things that come close: cleanliness, decency, goodness, honesty, honor, pureness, purity, truthfulness. When I ask my students for antonyms, I also get these words: morality, ethics, integrity, fairness, justice, equality, rule of law, and of course, transparency. Let's focus on this word transparency a bit, because for maybe the first generation of studies in corruption, transparency, some said, was the panacea. As a famous US Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said in, I think, the 1920s, sunshine is the best disinfectant. So several years ago, the editors of Webster's Dictionary chose transparency as their word of the year. And almost 70 countries now have right to know or freedom of information laws. And in 2005, the OECD stated, open government is increasingly recognized as an essential ingredient for democratic governance. And when Mexico enacted its right to know law, right to information law in 2002, President Vicente Fox said, hoy todos estamos en una caja de cristal porque hoy todo se ve, todo se lee, y todo se escucha. Okay. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way, and not just in Mexico. So have we been unrealistic in what we have expected from transparency? Have the rewards of greater transparency been oversold? The answer to these questions depends largely on what are the goals of greater transparency. Here's one view. When we talk about the right to information, we are talking about the distribution of political power. The distribution. I'm not so sure. Perhaps the better view, and one that is more consistent with what transparency can provide, is that transparency is important because it increases the likelihood that power will be exercised in a fairer and more thoughtful manner by those who have power. In this sense, transparency is less about the distribution of power than in how power is exercised. Now, we know a great deal about transparency: what it is, what kinds of laws are needed to increase transparency, how to implement those laws, the institutions needed to implement those laws. That is, we know a lot about the demand side of transparency. But transparency, I think, is not the end goal. The end goal is, or should be, accountability. That is how power is used. And what we know very little about is how do we get from transparency to accountability. In earlier and perhaps more innocent days, many believed that greater transparency would by itself lead to greater accountability, almost like a law of nature. Okay? And at the end of my presentation, hopefully, we're going to go to a website and I'll demonstrate how I don't think that is always true. Okay. The second thing I want to talk about is transparency and pervasive corruption. Okay. I'm in full agreement with what Bo Rothstein has written, that in countries where corruption is pervasive, corruption is a collective action problem. It's not a principal agent problem. So in those countries, the problem is not so much a lack of transparency, the problem is not information asymmetry. As Bo pointed out, people are well aware in countries where corruption is pervasive of who is corrupt, of what agencies are corrupt. They don't need to be told that they live in societies where corruption is pervasive. In fact, he argues that greater transparency can worsen corruption because this will make people even more aware of corruption and encourage those who are not corrupt to act in a corrupt fashion. The thinking being, I'm not going to be the only sap. I don't know how that translates into Spanish. I'm not going to be the only sap who doesn't play the game. I want to analogize this to a famous incident involving a woman named Kitty Genovese. I don't know if any of you have heard about this incident, which occurred, I think, in 1965 in New York City. And it's been studied by many sociologists and criminologists for what it means. Kitty Genovese was walking down the street in her own neighborhood when she was viciously attacked by a man and stabbed multiple times. Her pleas for help were heard by dozens of her neighbors. Not a single neighbor called the police. When this was first reported, it was interpreted as what has happened to the morality of citizens, particularly the citizens of New York. Where were they? Why didn't they help? Are they so cold and callous that no one tried to help her, even by calling the police? But there's another way to look at it. Most people who study this incident now think that no one acted because they thought, well, everyone can hear her screams. Someone else must be calling the police. Now, what does this have to do with transparency and then corruption? Well, I think you can analogize this tragedy or the failure of people to call the police as a collective action problem. In other words, the failure of so many to act was due to the perception of all the witnesses that everyone else was a principled principal, was a good neighbor, and therefore they expected someone else to act. So, is this analogous to too much transparency? In other words, when people have information about corruption, they expect that others will act, but not them. That is more food for thought. But I think there's a connection between what Bo was arguing about the problems of too much transparency and pervasive in cultures with pervasive corruption. Now, I am a lawyer, and as you know, lawyers are technologically challenged. Okay. But I want to take this a little further. As Bo has argued, if corruption is a collective action problem, what is needed is revolutionary change, or what he and others have called a big push that involves all major political, social, and economic institutions. These efforts must change shared expectations. And it should start at the top because, as many argue, the fish rots from the head down. And indeed, there's some support for this approach. We can see this in, for example, the efforts to root out corruption in the Hong Kong police force in the 1980s. Everyone knew, including the police in the Hong Kong police force, how corrupt the system was. A matter of fact, new recruits were told you had three options. You could either be on the bus, that is, participate in corrupt practices. You could run alongside the bus, meaning ignore corruption but don't do anything to fight the system. And your third option was to be under the bus. That meant if you fight the system, you would pay the consequences. Now, the Hong Kong Independent Commission Against Corruption made a number of recommendations which were largely implemented. One was go after the big fish first. Send a message going after the elites, and that will filter down and change the norms. And it was very effective. Okay? As a matter of fact, what happened in Hong Kong is one of the success stories we have in fighting pervasive corruption. Going after the big fish, okay, created more principled principles. I hope that translates very well. Thereby reducing corruption and improving public trust in the police force. However, I will argue that in pervasively corrupt countries, option 2, that is running alongside the bus, is really not a viable option. Because an individual will calculate the awards and benefits or incentives and disincentives and conclude option 2 makes no sense. They are trapped in a corrupt game, and not playing the game is not a viable option. So is the situation hopeless in pervasively corrupt countries? After all, how can norms be changed when most people play the corruption game, when they see playing the game as in their economic, social, and political interests? But I don't think it's hopeless. I want to end on a note of realistic optimism. Okay. It's based on the notion of the tipping point, which many of you have probably read about or heard about, which is, on reflection, a very common sense understanding of how change occurs and the rate at which change occurs. The tipping point is basically the idea that there's a point when a trend, any trend, that has increased or decreased incrementally will reach a point and suddenly decline dramatically or increase dramatically. This phenomenon has been observed in many contexts. Let's take crime rates, particularly homicide rates in New York City. In 1991, there were about 2,200 murders in New York City. At the rate of homicides this year, there will be about 325. So a dramatic decrease, but the decrease did not follow a clear linear path. It experienced one or two dramatic shifts downward. In other words, a tipping point was reached. We also see this phenomenon of the tipping point in terms of fashion. When certain types of clothes reach a tipping point, all of a sudden you see out of nowhere people wearing the same shoes, the same blouses, the same ties. And we certainly see it in things like graffiti. Many of you who have traveled to urban centers throughout the world will notice that there's either a lot of graffiti or no graffiti. Very often, nothing in between. Okay? So a wonderful example of this is the broken windows theory, which has to do with order versus disorder. And many of you might be familiar with this theory, made very famous by James Q. Wilson. So in the broken windows theory, if there is a street or a neighborhood with one broken window and that is not repaired, within a few days, you'll see dozens of broken windows. So here, the problem is a lack of principled principles brought about by a sense of pervasive disorder and pervasive lawlessness. I have lawfulness there, I meant lawlessness. However, with minimal, often state intervention, that is, fix the one or two broken windows, then you find that windows are not broken anymore. Okay? Why? Because within a reasonably short period of time, a tipping point is reached and a new norm, the norm of order and lawfulness, takes root. I think we can apply this to the situation where corruption is pervasive. So this would mean that the goal is not as daunting as may be thought. The goal then is not to get a majority of people or a majority of the elites to act non-corruptly. It is not even, I think, to get a significant portion of people or a significant portion of the elites to act non-corruptly. You need to get to a tipping point. I don't know what percentage that is. Although it would be interesting if we can get some research on this. But I think if you get to this tipping point, you will see dramatic decreases in corruption. Okay. I would now like to, do I have 2 or 3 more minutes? If we can go to a website, I want to illustrate the point of greater transparency. It's not working? I'm sorry? Should we try it or not? No. Well, let me illustrate what I was, or verbalize what I was going to illustrate, and you can all try this at home. In 1974, in the wake of the Watergate scandals, the United States passed what's called the Federal Election Campaign Act. The main purpose of this act was to require disclosure of all contributions to anyone running for federal office. There were limits on how much you could contribute, but the main point of the law was to make it transparent. You had to give your name and address. Now, with modern technology, even I can now get to these sites. Within 1 minute, I can find out how much anyone gave to any candidate for Senate, Congress, or President. So if you were to just go to www.fec, which is Federal Election Commission.gov, and you'll see on the left-hand side something about disclosure, one more click, and you put in anyone's name. Okay. So I did this the other day just in anticipation of trying to do that. I put in the name of the actor Matt Damon, knowing that he is popular in Mexico as well as in the United States. I saw every single contribution Matt Damon has given to candidates for federal office for the past, 10 years. Okay. You can also find his address, by the way, for those of you who might be stalkers. The point is, not only is the law effective, but it's easy to use. As I said, anyone can find out who gave to whom and how much. But what was the purpose of the law? The purpose of greater transparency was to make our elected officials more accountable. Well, you don't have to be a student of American politics to know that more than ever before, American elected officials are not seen and indeed are often not accountable to the voters. They are accountable to those who gave them money. And greater transparency has not resulted in greater accountability of most American elected officials. I am not arguing that transparency is not important. It's vital. But what we have to ask is how we get from transparency to accountability. So that was my first point, and the second had to do with corruption in pervasively corrupt societies, where I don't think it's as bleak as it might seem, because I think if we look harder, we will find that a tipping point can be reached, which is reachable, and when you get to that point, you will see dramatic decreases in the level of corruption. And I'll give one example of that, and this perhaps works in Mexico too, or any federal system of government. Let's take the United States. If you asked most Americans, well, what's the most corrupt state? They would probably say Louisiana, although New Jersey and Illinois are close behind, right? But if you were to look at state officials in Louisiana, where there are high levels of corruption, and compare them to federal officials in Louisiana, you'll see huge differences. Now, part of this could be accounted for by the fact that federal officials are generally paid better. But there's more going on. I mean, these are people with the same education, who hang out with the same people, live in the same environment, the same communities, but you find high levels of corruption in the state systems and relatively low levels of corruption in the federal system for the same type of jobs. Why is this? I think it has to do with whether a tipping point has been reached. And decades ago, some would say centuries ago in Louisiana, a tipping point was reached. a certain percentage of people were seen as corrupt, and then everyone, it becomes a collective action problem, and everyone participates, or almost everyone participates. In the federal system, that tipping point was never reached. So you get relatively low levels of corruption. And I imagine if you look in Mexico, you might find in some states similar results. In some states, some state officials, there might be pervasive corruption, but in the same state, federal officials will be relatively non-corrupt. Again, I offer this as food for thought and perhaps an area of further research. But if so, I think it confirms the idea of corruption as being a collective action problem, and also we could add the tipping point theory and apply it to that situation. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor Schneider. Ya nuestros panelistas nos están poniendo no solo al tanto de formas de entender y hablar corrupción, sino también del tamaño del problema y de las soluciones. Nos dicen que se necesita un Big Bang, un Big Push, cosas mucho más ambiciosas, grandes que lo que a veces parece estar en la agenda de reformas o en la agenda legislativa o en la agenda de modificaciones, de planeación, que tienen siempre el tema de la corrupción presente, pero como un asunto marginal al cual hay que dedicarle unas cuantas líneas o un par de reflexiones, pero no una política pública integral vinculada con rendición de cuentas. Finalmente, para cerrar este panel, tengo el enorme gusto de presentar a Huguette Lavelle, que es presidenta de Transparencia Internacional. Ella es conocida por todos ustedes por el trabajo que ha hecho en esta importante organización internacional que en las últimas décadas se ha dedicado a poner el tema de la corrupción en el centro del debate público, no solo como un problema normativo, sino como algo que afecta esencialmente de manera cotidiana la vida de las personas. Además de eso, ella ha sido ministra en distintos departamentos del gobierno canadiense, es miembro del Consejo del Global Compact de las Naciones Unidas y del Grupo de Asesores Externos del Banco Mundial para Gobernabilidad y Estrategias de Anticorrupción, así como asesora en el Grupo sobre Cambio Climático y Desarrollo Sustentable del Banco Asiático de Desarrollo. Adelante, por favor, Vi, bienvenida.
Buenos días, señoras y señores. Es un placer para mí estar con ustedes hoy. And please forgive me to turn back to English when so many of you are speaking Spanish in this room. I was just mentioning to Mona Donna that I feel that if any one of us lives in the Americas, we should speak Spanish. I made sure my children do. Mine is not good enough for you today. I think, as was mentioned earlier this morning, of course, corruption manifests itself in many different ways in different countries. There's not one cookie cutter that we can talk about. This morning, I would like to deal with three aspects of what we talk about when we talk about corruption. That is, we're talking more about the impact of corruption. We're talking more about what has not been working as well, what is missing, and what we should be looking to improve on. And I'd like to go back to the impact and what I'm calling the real people in our societies, those that are at the receiving end of corruption, know what it's all about. They're the victims. They may contribute, they may pay the bribe because they may not have any choice, or because everybody else does it and therefore they seem to be in this quagmire. But down deep, people know very well, I agree with you, Mona Donna, of what is right and what is not. And we see the damage to individuals, to societies, to the economy, to social stability, in our countries, and we see how it affects quality of life and life itself. Transparency International released recently its barometer, which is a survey this year of 114,000 people in over 100 countries. And we asked them very specific question. One of them was, did you have to pay a bribe last year to access essential services, access to water, electricity, to get a license, to have to pay a bribe to a police? And 27% said they had. But in certain countries of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, 50% said they had to pay a bribe in the previous year. In Mexico and Bolivia, 3 out of 4 said that they had to pay a bribe in order to access essential services. So that's one thing for us to keep in mind. And when I talk about impact of corruption, I think we need to talk more about the impact of corruption. And of course, it's sometimes difficult to deal with causality. We have to refer very much more to correlations. But there are so many specific, real examples of its impact on people that I think we have a lot to work with, so that the leaders, those with power who exercise corruption, extortion, have less place to hide because they're exposed, and also because the people who are at the receiving end need to be informed, need to be mobilized, in a sense, to know that they don't have to pay a bribe unless their life is in danger, or that of their family, which sometimes it is. Now, let me just say a few words about the social impact I mentioned earlier. One of them, for example, the World Health Organization has come out with a study indicating that about 700,000 people die every year from malaria and tuberculosis alone because of counterfeit medication. That's one aspect of it. It's one impact of it that we need to think about. We know that where there is money, the vulnerability of corruption is much higher. Procurement, construction, and according to cost, about 4 trillion annually is lost through, of course, some mismanagement, some inefficiency, and a lot of corruption in the field of public construction. And in some cases, it can be up to 30% more that it costs to build a road because of bribery that's been paid before. Of course, we have all heard as well about the diversion of resources, which means that people, especially the poor, are double victims. Not only are they asked to pay a bribe to get their child immunized or to gain access to the school system, but at the same time, these services are barely available because the money has gone out of the country instead of going into the treasury. And here, you know, we know about some of the leaders. Our assessment is that about 500 billion has been lost, and very few of it has been, I'm sorry, not 500, 180 billion has been lost from some of the corrupt leaders, with about 5 billion returned to the country. We also know that international cartels have created direct economic losses to consumers through overcharges. And here we have a figure of almost 500 billion. Now, we also, in terms of impact, realize the damage done. We're talking about democracy earlier, but let's talk about those that have been entrusted with managing the common good, the people who are in office, national, state, and local level. And what corruption does is undermine the trust in those people. People then vote less, or take sometimes in their own hand some of the things that should best be managed by those entrusted with the public good. In terms of illicit flows, tax evasion, money laundering, again, massive impact on all of us in our own countries, be it in the West or in less developed countries. And just maybe a last point on the impact, because one can have a very long list of impacts of corruption on people and on lives. But if you look at the issue of shoddy construction, probably most of our countries would have experienced some of that. It's not just the garment workers in Bangladesh, where over 1,000 lost their lives, because it seems, according to fairly good sources, it's in front of the courts at this time, so one has to be careful about attributing anything to any one individual, but that some of the regulators looked the other way in terms of the shoddy construction and the shoddy state of those things. But we can go to Turkey. Of course, the experience in this country about the kindergarten children who died out of a fire, I think, is another very interesting example, but all of our countries could have some of this. Now, let me just turn quickly to the issue of what are the things that we know are, add to the complexity of corruption. One is that the sophistication of those who corrupt, who are facilitators of corruption, who are the corruptors, is extremely high. Those people can afford to buy outstanding services. The second area is that the resilience of the networks who operate corruption is also very high. You will have a new government coming into power, having made a decision that corruption will be their number one priority. And it sometimes worked for the first 6 months, the first year. And then suddenly you see that the roadmap which they had developed is less and less being met. And this is when you have a sense that the facilitators of corruptions, the networks of corruption, are at work alive and well. And I think we also see increasingly the multiplicity of tools that corruptors are using. It's no longer just buying people. It's, of course, leading by fear, and it's infiltration of the institutions in our societies, from the judiciary in certain countries right to the mayors or even at higher levels of government. I think another point that we know is because of internet, because of globalization, which there are many positive aspects with it, but it also makes it much easier to move illicit money around the world at a click of the mouse and or of the finger. And that, of course, is making it much more difficult for forensic auditors, for those who are trying to get to that stolen money, to really find it. We also are hearing more and more is being written about the nexus of corruption, illicit trade, money laundering, and illicit trade in arms, in people, and in drugs. And we need to understand much more than we do already on some of that. And of course, when we look at the pushback, and when does lobbying becomes making representations to improve a policy, a law, to crossing that barrier of becoming one where for their own, for those that they represent, trying to prevent regulations that would protect people from happening, and of clientelism, of doing what we were just hearing before, of making sure that there are services provided to those lawmakers who should be able to stand up. We also know, because we have not only heard it this morning, but before, that most of our countries have very good legislation. The rules are there, the laws are there, the institutions are there. Big problem becomes implementation and enforcement. And that's where I think when we talk about corruption, we need to put much more effort. Now, we also heard earlier that corruption can become what one could call the norm in our society. And when that happens, it becomes much more difficult. If it is pervasive, it is much more difficult to attack than when you try to deal with it early on. I'm an optimist. It still is possible to deal with it. And also, of course, we found that if the benefits of corruption outweigh the penalties or the lack of penalties, then, of course, the corrupt will continue with their trade unabated. I would like to just move on very quickly. I know that the time is important here and we want to hear from you. But looking at what is working and what we need to look at as we talk about corruption looking forward. There is no silver bullet. I think we've all come to the conclusion that it is not just one thing that will make the difference, that you need a composite solution or set of items that will be part of the solution, and that it has to be at all levels of government. It has to be in the corporate sector. It has to be in the para-governmental institutions. And that means that we need the right institutions. We need the right systems in place. We need strong leadership. We need people engagement. At Transparency International, we spent a lot of our first 20 years focusing on systems, on institutions, especially at the national level, working with industry and leaders of industry, and that's still very important. But we've turned our attention more recently much more on working with people, so that not only do we work at the top because it doesn't trickle down very quickly, but working with the people and engaging the people in finding the solutions and in working with their own governmental institutions can make a difference much faster. And I have a lot of examples of this, which I will spare you this morning. We need, of course, to have clean elections. And again, there's a lot of work that remains to be done in that context in many of our countries. As part of that composite set, we need parliaments that are there for the public good as well. They're not only there to oversee the executive, but also to be able to ensure that they act with integrity, that they disclose their assets, that they disclose their conflict of interest and prevent them, and not just their own assets, but that of their family. We need strong leadership and committed leadership. We need that roadmap of all the required elements. We need strong oversight institutions, and I go to the auditors. I always used to say when I was a deputy minister in the Canadian government that my best insurance policy was my audit and evaluation section, because they could help us to detect early issues that we should be dealing with. We need, whether they are anti-corruption commissions, ombudsman, access to information, very important. Not only access to information as a privilege, but access to information as a right of the people. And there are very few things in most of our institutions that cannot be made automatically available on the net every day. Whether it is the financing, what we pay as governments, what we receive in terms of revenues, the extractive industries, what they pay to governments, what their overall agreements are, what their net revenues are, and so on, so that it does bring that transparency. And I'd just like to close by saying one or two words in terms of what we also need. And I go back to some of the points that have been made this morning. And that is that you can have all of this, as I found out when I was in government myself. But unless you have a set of very strong, you can call them principles, that guide people's work, which are based in ethics, which are based on service to the public, which I would always call, integrity, transparency, accountability, people engagement, and developing a very strong ethical compass in all of those that work in our institutions, and starting with young people. And this is where the education system is so important in all of our countries. And, in conclusion, I think that this meeting is a very positive sign. Today, people are not afraid to talk about corruption. 20 years ago, people did not. Although today, still in our barometer, when we asked people, if you see fraud, if you see people stealing, if you see an issue of corruption, will you report it? More than 50% said no, because I would be afraid for what would happen to me. A little bit less than 50% said no, because I don't think it would matter. It would not change anything. And I think that's where we can spend more of our own energy, or collective energy, to be able to make a difference in that context. But if left unchecked, I think corruption has led to economic crisis, to political crisis, resulting in a disastrous cycle of impunity, where people can get away with corruption, and they can corrupt the institutions. So I think that restoring all of that has to be what all of us in this room want to go back to and spend a lot of our energy on. It's really worth it. Thank you very much.